Okay, we're live. It is June 29th, 2022. It's about 2:03 past the hour. It's a beautiful day in Austin, Texas, and kind of clear skies. We had some thunderstorms, a little bit of rain yesterday that we needed much. But back to heat. We have a great guest today. But before we get rolling, we're going to have some music from Dr. Butler.
Amarillo by morning, up from San Antonio. The only thing that I've got is what I've got on.
That lights are on.
Well, I ain't got a dime, but what I got is mine. Ain't rich, but Lord, I'm free. Amarillo by morning, Amarillo is where I'll be.
All right. Thank you, John.
Bravo, bravo.
Thank you very much.
We got a lot of stuff going on in the world, John. I'm curious, what's your take? We're in the middle of summer. Everybody is probably looking up to next semester, but we seem to be treading water in many things. A lot of things are under control. A lot of things are still unraveling. Week has gone by, and do we see a light at the end of the tunnel here in our headwinds?
Well, I've listened to a lot of commentaries. And I like my colleagues Llewellyn King's commentaries on electricity and where he's at the conference, and how he really weaves history into the present things that's going on. There's a lot going on, and what we see is this: we have a stock market that's sort of up and down, whereas unemployment is fine. We have stocks are down and bonds are down and stocks are down at the same time, and mathematically we haven't seen that since the 1920s or whatever have you. Then of course we have the war that's going on in Europe that's really continuing to mess with the supply chain. And then of course we got the petroleum stuff going on, the price of oil. But in all of this, and the world is in turmoil, there's a normalcy about everything. People tend to go about their normal days. The airlines are a mess now. I had a good friend who pilots did not show up, so he had to stay all night in New Jersey. And then when you look at the entrepreneurship stuff, I think that it is booming. But the great thing is it's been hot in Austin, Texas, and we kept our electricity. And I think that's a great thing. So Andreas, the world has always been crazy. It is really crazy now. And then I turn the television on and I see some chatting about the president and the takeover of America. I don't know if it's a trial or what is it, but I do know that when you ride, you break the glass out of the local drugstore and not the Capitol. So I don't know what the hell is going on here. I don't know if it's a trial or I don't know if we need it, but it's going on. So it's just a lot going on.
Yeah, absolutely. The interesting times. Llewellyn King, how are you, sir?
I'm well, thank you. All is well, except in the world, all is not well. Where do you want me to begin? With the tale of woe, which is what stretches before us. If the war in Ukraine is not concluded by the winter, NATO will break wide open because the Germans will need gas, and so will other countries, and they will actually treat with Moscow to get the gas, and that may be a severe blow to the Ukrainians. Also, there's a question: how long can these poor people last? We're sending them material to continue the hostilities, but there are no foreign troops, and it's just a very ugly, nasty situation. And the individual cases of suffering are beyond contemplation. They are just terrible. Domestically, we've got lots of problems. They're not insuperable, but they're problems. Electricity, one of your favorite subjects, Andres, electricity, we're going to have a shortage. I did a program with the United States Energy Association this morning. I do these broadcasts once a month, and had some experts on. And we cannot electrify at the rate we're planning to electrify unless we build an awful lot of generation. And here's the rub. We can build new generation enough to take care of the new demand, but not close down the old gas and coal. If we close down the gas and coal, we cannot all drive Teslas. And that is an equation that is not being dealt with adequately. I think people know about it. Our colleague from CPS Energy was very articulate on the subject. They want him to close out his coal generation, and they want him to meet new load because San Antonio is growing, just as fast as Austin, or the same rate of growth or somewhat close. We've got peculiarities going on. The Department of Energy issues a study by how many jobs are being created in energy. But I heard, and I heard it again this morning, people saying, we can't get from here to there because we don't have enough people. So why are we worrying about trying to create jobs when we can't fill the jobs we have? That seems like a disconnect. There are a lot of strange disconnects. We have a supply chain problem that is now affecting everything. And it goes in the electric industry from things as small as bolts to very large bulk electric equipment. But these same problems exist everywhere. They're for steel, they're for finished goods, they're for paints, for coatings. We're going to be in a very tough period for quite a long time. And one of the consequences of supply shortage is inflation. Prices go up when things are in short supply. We are going into the summer. We are producing refined oil as fast as we can. Our refinery is running about 95% of capacity, which is nearly as far as they can go, given that they're very complex and fragile in a sense in installations. So we've got shortage. This has become the decade of shortage, and we didn't expect it. And it's come and is tremendously disagreeable. On the upside, when you have shortage, you have invention, you have creativity, and wonderful things appear that were never dreamed of before.
Absolutely, absolutely. I do hear though that the recession is on its way, according to many experts, and some people are predicting that it's going to be anywhere from 18 months to 36 months. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. In the meantime, I see a lot of activity. Obviously, the federal funding on infrastructure and many other things are going on. So I'm curious, what our guest thinks. But before that, let's just say hello. Darren Anderson, how are you, sir? Oh, you're muted.
I'm great. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad you're with us today. Let me introduce you for those of you that don't know him and are listening. Darren Anderson is the Director of Strategy and Innovation at the Texas Department of Transportation. And he's going to be with us for the hour. He is responsible for many things, including the leadership and strategic direction of the innovation and continuous improvement of people and processes of the agency, not a small task. And he oversees strategic planning, research, and technology implementation divisions. He has a great background, I believe, ex-military, and he's a Longhorn, John Butler.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Darren, I want you to know I have met every group, every parent, and we got the top recruits out of New Orleans, and then we got a top recruit from New Iberia. And I've been in that recruiting, and that's saying something. I am an LSU Tiger.
Wow. Wow.
Helped playing the game at 19, and but the Longhorns will be undefeated this year. We'll beat Alabama. You can write that down.
Well, I appreciate the enthusiasm.
Oh, I got a lot of enthusiasm.
So Darren, welcome to the program. What's your take on, perhaps, obviously you're a global citizen, but maybe you're focused more Texas. You've heard, sort of the intro commentary from our colleagues here. And what's your take on, transportation, COVID, post-COVID, the economy, infrastructure investment? What's going on in the transportation world?
Well, I mean, you guys hit on several issues because I think it's all interrelated. The system of systems. We just are one part of it. But unemployment. I know that we've recovered quite a bit from the lows of the height of COVID, but we're still short relative to the original numbers in terms of recovering completely to the original unemployment level. So I think there's opportunity, and I think you notice that everywhere you go. I think it's in whatever industry you look at, there are shortfalls. You mentioned the airlines, and if it's not pilot shortages, it's pilots that retired or pilots that didn't want to get a COVID shot or whatever it may be. And I think that's rippled across all sectors. So, we're challenged just like everyone else is challenged. I think there's concern. You see growing concern across the nation, not necessarily just in Texas, about the impact of inflation as it relates to the infrastructure bill. Have we gained or have we lost net effect in terms of what was provided in the infrastructure bill versus what the inflation rates look like? And that certainly gets into heavy detail. It depends on what you're looking at, what materials, is it steel, is it aggregate, and could it be across the board? And then exacerbate that by the challenges of logistics on top of that, and the ability to move the goods where you need them to be. And that's, like I said, that's not just us, right? That depends, that is affecting everybody. And in my world of emerging technologies, the part that I spend most of my time on as it relates to mobility, it's, what's the future going to be? I mean, for the last 5 to 10 years, we've been talking heady stuff about autonomy and electrification and connectedness and 5G and digital twins. And much like everybody else, I hope that as a nation, we can continue down those paths without much interruption. Obviously, we already see that interruption happening across the markets with chip shortages and shortages of, precious metals and raw materials and, vehicles themselves. And so I don't know what it's going to look like in the next, you hit on the recession potentially going another 2 years. It could even be longer. I worry sometimes if we're not just going right from recession to something even worse, if we can't begin to find ways to at least stem, the bloodletting, if you will, in each sector. It's something that I'm not really old, but I've lived through the 70s and the recessions and stuff back then. And it seems to me that what's different now that I don't think we've ever experienced in quite some time is it seems to be in every market that there's a shortfall, a supply challenge, an inflation issue. And so it's very broad, and that's something that we haven't had to recover from, in the recent decades. And so it is cause for pause, and I think it's cause for, being open, right? I think the biggest challenge is we have so much ideology on either side of the coin and in political positions that are impacting our ability to just be very frank about I love Llewellyn's comments about energy. We could have an energy policy that moves towards electrification, but also recognizes maybe we need to do it incrementally, and that might be a smarter way to do that than just jumping feet first into what seems to be happening now. So I don't know. We'll see. It'll play out. That's for certain.
Yeah. Well, I have been sounding the alarm about electrification for a long time. Nobody really has done the numbers like we have in our consulting. And I think all of you have heard them, Texas, 22 million vehicles, turn them on into 100 kilowatt hour batteries, 2,200 gigawatts of power needed if they were to connect at the same time. We all know that that's not going to be the case, but 2,200 gigawatts is a big delta from the 80 gigawatts that ERCOT produces. So where is the juice going to come from is the question. So
and when
that's going to start
day,
happening everywhere.
Absolutely. I think that the shape of the load is very important. And I like the word shape. For example, solar, particularly in Texas, the shape is almost ideal, except for the last hour and a half of the peak. at between 5 and 7:30 at night. Otherwise, solar fits the load fairly well in Texas. Not the case everywhere, of course. I'd like to ask Darren, if I might,
Yeah.
what I've been looking at transportation as an amateur for a very long time, from moving sidewalks to every kind of public transport, getting away possibly from some of the old ideas. I mean, like a lot of people of my generation, I thought transportation was subways and buses. I find out it's scooters and mopeds. I go to Vietnam and I look at the traffic, the incredible traffic in the cities where you couldn't get a car in among the mopeds and scooters. Is that our future? Or is there going to be some huge change that makes it different? We had a very interesting program as part of this broadcast recently, where a city manager said they were using Uber as their primary transportation, a contract with Uber. I thought that was very interesting. I think it has its own problems. How do the unbanked use it, the unsophisticated? Can you really drive the costs down far enough? What happens? I've also looked at buses around the world. Buses only to me seem to work when you can do a conveyor belt, like in London. If you don't get a number 13 now, in 1 minute, there'll be another one, number 13. If they come every 2 hours, it gets to be an agonizing. There's a bus stop outside my apartment here. Much as I like buses, in the 10 years I've lived here, I've never caught the bus. I don't know where it's going. It's badly signposted. There's nowhere to sit where it stops. How, when you look as an innovator to the future, do you see some huge technological breakthrough that will maybe make subways obsolete? Or are we going to see flying taxis? What are you working on?
So is there a magic pill?
If there is a magic pill, Donnie's got a business plan for it.
I do.
Yeah, we're ready to take it. Yeah, I mean, so I'll look at it a couple ways. I mean, you could do the very pie in the sky, and we could talk about how everything could be wondrously moved forward. What do I think is probably going to happen, assuming that nothing gets worse? And as we talked about supply and all that, I do think you're going to see much greater electrification of delivery systems of the freight side of the house, not necessarily the long haul, but certainly the in and around box trucks, everything down to sidewalk robots. And at the same time, much greater automation. I think the industry is certainly moving towards electrification and is beginning to look at automation, at least between big warehouses and business to business type movement. And as they solve for that, and if they can get comfortable with that, then I think that they're going to move to greater automation in delivery in the local sense. But I mean, we already saw what, COVID pushed or probably caused to happen much more rapidly than anticipated was the move of telecommunications and allowing people to work much more from home, like I'm doing today, along with delivery to the home in a way that never before, probably was accomplished. And so we don't really know what that's going to do in terms of the urbanization and densification of cities. There were a lot of people that were pushing for that pre-COVID, and then there's been I feel at least a significant shift to people in the homes, and even extending what the suburbs means, because they don't necessarily have to be at an office in a downtown, and that creates a dramatic shift in where work-life balance happens and what that means for the economy that supports that. So it's hard to determine, at least in terms of personal mobility, what that's truly going to mean. Is that going to mean, again, more densification and more, as you talked about it, are we going to get to the point where we have just way too much congestion in the city? Certainly we could. I think the cities have an opportunity right now to reimagine their downtown mobility solutions. And a lot of them talk a lot about bus lanes and bike lanes. And I sometimes say, what about, as I said, the sidewalk robots and other, scooter lanes and things like that, if you're going to look at all of that. But they're not necessarily doing it. They're not doing it in broad. And I know why. I feel I know why. Because I think there's businesses there that impacts. And so they haven't figured out the balance yet of how do you enable all this mobility that you want to achieve of these different types, and then still sustain the businesses that support the population that's a part of a downtown. And I think it's a huge, a unique challenge that, they have to balance.
Texas.
I would like to see that happen in Texas and in Texas cities more. I think another challenge we have to acknowledge our environment, right? We have to acknowledge that we might have a full summer of 100-degree days, and that's not very enjoyable to get out on a scooter or bike and do, throughout the day. Yes, sir.
Let me bring you back home to Texas. This is not England. This is not a place where cities are crowded upon each other. When my students go see grandma in El Paso, it's 11 hours by car. When I go up to Lubbock to see the Longhorn play, it's 8 hours by car. The truth of the matter is Texans like to treat their cars like horses.
Yes.
We're not interested in bike lanes and scooters and those kind of things. So going back, when I got here in 1974 and we had problems with communication, we got a good old boy down there named Herb Kelleher, my dear friend. I love him to death. He gave me $10 million when I did the Herb Kelleher Center at the University of Texas. And Herb solved the problem of going from city to city. And we have another Longhorn who did a great company called Von Lane. Have you heard of Von Lane?
Oh,
and
yeah.
what that is, Llewellyn, what he did was to make a luxury bus like a private airplane. Alex did that. So my question to you is this: forget about the cities, okay? I want to know, how do I get to Dallas and Houston and San Antonio to do business? Are we going to do fast trains? Are we going to do Von Lane? What are we going to do? Because when I drive to Houston, it's 2.5 hours. Dallas is 3.5 hours. San Antonio is now Austin. It's like 40 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So what's your vision for the state of Texas? Will Southwest Airlines be replaced? Will it be replaced by Von Lane? As Llewellyn said, will we be flying Uber from city to city? What's your vision?
Boring tunnels.
Trying to make me like a New Yorker and get on a damn scooter.
Maybe boring tunnels.
It could be a combination of all those too, right? That's when you're faced with an increasing population, that kind of changes the dynamic of that. If you were fixed or decreasing, you may be able to focus on one and say that's going to be able to sustain the population. But we're not in that, at least, currently in that situation. In fact, the state demographer continues to say we'll approach nearly double the size of the state in population by 2050. I think it's a little lower now, but it's a good question. So you have high-speed rail trying to establish itself between Houston and Dallas. It has wins and losses, it seems, almost monthly in terms of are they making headway or not. I think they lost some people seemingly in the last few weeks, but then they got some good news on their authorities, I think, in the last week. So we'll see how that plays out. That's a real potential if all of those can be solved and if the investment can be solved, right? It's a huge term, a huge outlay of capital. There was a lot of interest in Hyperloop in the state, in bringing that into the state. There's clearly routes that would seem to fit that model. I still think that that's a real potential in the future, although it's not proven yet, but they're making headway, and I could almost see that in some sense leapfrog the need for high-speed rail, or at least complement it, right? The challenges for both, and many other than right-of-way and those kind of issues, tends to be everybody wants a stop. Well, as soon as you add stops, then it's no longer high speed, whether it's rail or Hyperloop, right? So you have to accept that those modes might be for long distance travel, right?
Right.
Darren,
And the biggest trend down in Texas is, in Texas Monthly about 2 years ago, they had an article on how wealth was moving to small towns to revitalize them.
Right.
Entrepreneurs were moving to small towns to revitalize them. And like you said, with the connectivity, I can sit here and talk to my good friend Llewellyn King and have a great conversation. I don't have to be in his great state, right? So So my question is, all of these things would come together, and I'm going to leave you with a comment. It's all about the business world. I want to know, Llewellyn knows, I want to know, how do I do business? Like you said, we don't want to affect the business world or the people downtown. If I have to, if we can combine Austin and Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Brownsville together for business purpose, how do I get there quickly to do my business?
Well, that's
Go ahead,
very
Lou.
interesting. I would like to ask Darren quickly, what is the speed that you're talking about for the high-speed rail? I often hear high-speed rail mentioned, and do you need high speed? I mean, I assume that traditional rail up to 150 miles an hour, which is what Amtrak achieves in the Northeast on certain sections, or 125 miles an hour, which is the standard intercity speed in Britain. Without high speed, this doesn't have all of the technological challenge of high speeds, everything from wheels to power supply. What do you mean by high speed, and why not just go for 150 miles an hour? It's very fast if you don't stop.
Well, I think you're asking some, I'm not the rail guy, but I mean, high-speed rail, I think Nissan in Japan gets up to 300 to 350 miles.
I know about that. You can get almost up to 400 miles an hour. You need two things. You need a lot of money, and you need a lot of open space. The
Right,
reason that the TGV really was successful in France was they decided not to go into the cities with it. And France being largely an agricultural country, still, there's a lot of open space. And they don't go, you start in the city, you might start in Paris, but if you're going to Lyon, you're not going through any towns or cities. It's too
Right.
dangerous. And Texas, in that sense, is ideal if you have the money and the proven need. And at what point does flying, seem a lot more attractive, particularly if we do get the kind of vertical takeoff flight that we talked on this program about just last time.
I mean, you guys are hitting the nail on the head of all the arguments. Why do we need high-speed rail? Why do we need Hyperloop? Those are the kind of questions that are thrown up, and they're valid questions. And that's the challenge that those companies have in getting into the state. They have to solve not only their technical problems, but they have to meet the political challenges of, well, why do we need to do this? Why can't we just use, maybe a more expanded Amtrak passenger system? I love that. The other thing I was going to mention is there is a growing interest in the state in urban air mobility, in vertical takeoff and landing. There's quite a bit of work being done, in the central Texas, near the Bryan College Station area and in just east of Austin and near Bastrop area. And there we have a council or an advisory body that's putting together a report that was directed by the legislature on what could the state do to facilitate further development of that. And I really think, I mean, if it's for real, right? If it really works well, if they can reach the price points that they need to reach, and if they can reach the passenger capacities that they want to reach, you have an option there that can go much shorter ranges than what you would need for a rail system to be profitable, and cover all those areas that Johnny was talking to about. As you get outside of the triangle, you get into West Texas and in other cities, you could have much more satellite movement around the major urban centers, but still be able to service people that want to live in a different area and prosper in their businesses out there. So I think that's a real opportunity. Really can't speak to the boring company and the tunneling. I mean, that's, what's happening in Vegas. We'll kind of see what happens. And I know there's some interest that they have in this state, but really hasn't caught fire in terms of a place to do that yet.
Yeah. Let me run a bunch of things by you, being a technology guy, Darren, and maybe this will spark some of the things that you guys are working on. So we track all these digital transformation trends, right? And so telecom and 5G. So when I say to you 5G, what does that mean to the DOT? What is 5G high-speed broadband? What does that do for DOT?
It enables both our business networks and our operational networks, in the simplest form.
Right.
Obviously, our business networks are everyday administrative operations, but when you get into mobility and movement, and I'll focus on the roads because that's primarily what we construct. We've been working in the connected vehicle space for quite some time, trying to determine what that means, and not just for vehicles, but everything, all mobility modes. And how do we communicate with them? There was a long time where the solution set was DSRC radio waveforms, but clearly they're losing out in terms of spectrum, and 5G is becoming the much more ubiquitous way that we're looking at it. That's going to be done. So I think broadband, I know broadband can be provided by a number of means, not just 5G cellular. So I think we try to think of it as broadband as a whole will be the space where that data about mobility and safety and traffic conditions will move. And we're wrestling with that, right? I mean, if we wanted to build our own network, it'd be a huge investment, just like it would be for any telecom to do the same thing. I think that there's great opportunity for combined capabilities. I think that those capabilities could not only provide traffic coverage, but could provide broadband into the surrounding homes. I believe that it could support things like a terrestrial GPS signal to be a even more refined signal than what we get from space, and maybe a backup to that if that ever got knocked out.
Right.
And a number of other types of sensors and communications devices that would enable things like first responder networks, or you name it. What would be a system that would be helpful not only to government needs, but also to public needs? And you could see that be consolidated in shared costs in a network. And I think that that's where we're headed. I think Texas government entities, including TXDOT, will ultimately be a player in that universe, not necessarily the complete builder of that, because it's expensive to do. And it's one reason why we don't have a fiber network across the entire state already for traffic management. Just like telecom providers don't have fiber networks everywhere in the state, or we wouldn't be talking about broadband expansion.
Right.
So I think there's great opportunity there, and I think it will significantly help us with things like machine guided construction, autonomy and movement of autonomous systems, and communicating to them in ways that may not even be imagined yet in terms of what needs to be known from them or shared with them. As well as, again, I mentioned, safety messages and other data about the system that would be useful not only to a robotic system, but human systems now. And we're trying to leapfrog forward on those, and the network's just a part of doing that.
Right.
And
Real quick, Johnny, Darren, when I say to you, in electrification is something we touched on, but I want you to go deeper on that real quick, because a lot of people don't think that TXDOT or the Department of Transportation is driving this, and actually you guys are driving a lot of it. When I say to you, F-150 Lightning, my favorite truck, I can charge it at work for free, and I can run my house with it, and it's an amazing vehicle, and it's all electric.
And you haven't got one, and no one else has one.
No, that's not true, Llewellyn.
I've never seen one.
The truck has been shipping for 2 months. There are 50,000 of them on the road already.
I have seen Rivians and other electric.
The F-150 is on the road already, Llewellyn.
I haven't seen it. I just
That's okay.
That. So much is hanging on this amazing vehicle.
It's coming. It's already here.
That is perfect. That's going to revolutionize everything, because everybody is going to be so happy, and the utilities are going to get power off it at night.
Can we hear from Darren?
So the question is, what do I think about electrification of 150s, or just in general?
Well, what's your take on it? I mean, electrification is coming, but if you take the F-150 Lightning, and it generally changes the whole paradigm of who connects, who serves energy. What's your thought of mobility becoming now the main actor of electrification? So
3 or 4 plus years ago, I used to say, all this discussion about electrification of vehicles is wonderful, and I understand the reasons that people want to do it, or to pick a zero emission other alternative fuel solution. But I said, so the reality is you have some very small penetration from that market and very few vehicles. And then obviously Tesla began to produce more. And am I still with you? Because it looks like you froze. Okay, look like you froze for a second.
No.
And then I said also that I think a bellwether moment would be if an F-150 was if Ford actually electrified a 150. And I said, why is that? Well, because it's, the largest, I think it's the largest selling vehicle type in this state, certainly.
Mhm.
And it would signal something that was not, that instead of being a niche thing that supports, just people that are ecologically aligned, you're talking about a workhorse vehicle that represents a much different, body of users.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, I'll agree with Llewellyn. A lot of these things are promised, and it's a much longer timeline than people. It sounds all buzzy and heady in the news, but the reality is those timelines are stretched over a decade at least.
Mhm.
And as we know, that doesn't even account for rollover of the fleet that people own now, right? You have to actually go buy one at some point when your car no longer is viable, and costs are going to be an issue. Access to charging stations will be an issue. Certainly, if you're not a single family homeowner.
That's a good, can I do a follow up on that comment? So you own all these highways and you have these rest stops. Are you planning on charging stations on the rest stops?
So you may know in the infrastructure bill, I think you do, that TXDOT is, all the state DOTs are responsible for developing electric vehicle charging station infrastructure plans. And TXDOT has that, responsibility for the state. I'm responsible for that plan. And there are a number of stipulations. We have to build out what are called the alternative fuel corridors first, which are essentially our interstates in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And those have to be built to a certain standard every 50 miles and within 1 mile of the interstate. And there's other requirements. Once those are all built out, then we can shift to the rest of the state with the remainder of the funding. Now, we do have a large amount of funding relative to other states. We have over 400 million over 5 years coming to us, and that doesn't have to be all spent in those 5 years. We won't even begin to initiate contracts to deploy probably until late this calendar year or beginning of next calendar year, because our plan doesn't even have to be approved until the end of September.
Mm-hmm.
We're not allowed to put it on our rest stops. That's federal law. We're not allowed to do it for profit, and that's an issue for obviously the people that would deploy it. But the plan is drafted. We have a web page. If you search for Texas Electrical Vehicle Planning, you can find it right there on the web page, and the plan has got a link at the very top, and there's a lot of great stuff at the bottom of the page that has links to other maps and things, so you can see exactly what we're proposing as draft locations. And we're making, the goal with our money is to make sure that the state has connectivity capability across the state. It certainly will not support a future of 22 million Texas vehicles plus. That we currently have, but it could support probably about 1 million plus vehicles, maybe even up to 2 million moving across the state. But there's a lot of variables in that. We don't know how much people charge at home. Certainly, if you live in an apartment, you don't necessarily have that option. And I love your comment about free charging at work. I love your office that does that for you, because I don't think everybody's going to do that. But that all, it's a dynamic that's never been faced with the gasoline based economy, where all that fueling more or less happened at a gas station. Now we don't know how that will be done as a whole, and we don't know how the revenues will be collected off of that as a whole compared to what we do now. So there's quite a bit of work being done to kind of think through what's the best way to address that, and don't have an optimum solution yet.
Will there be a TXDOT line item on my registration bill in the future if I'm an electric user?
I don't know. I can say that. I honestly don't know. And we can't advocate. There were several bills in the last session that approached the initial challenge with additional registration fee that DMV would collect relative to electric vehicles. That's a potential. Some, there probably half the states have something like that. But that again doesn't address all the same exact issues that you see with gasoline taxes collected. And so I think our legislature will probably consider some of that this session. I would expect at least a discussion on it.
Yeah.
But I still think there's time.
Darren, your analysis of the traffic with enough sensors and enough electronics in the highway and in vehicles, do you have some projection of how much density, how much more density the existing road systems can take? Can it be like 20% more, 50% more? And just as a comment, Andres better know that he was getting free fuel at work. He must declare it on his income tax.
I don't think we have a hard number. I mean, there are a lot of people that speculate if you had a fully autonomous system that you could greatly decrease lane widths and get much more close following in the vehicles, and that could, you could significantly increase the capacity 20 to 30% on existing systems. But that's a far off in the future reality. I mean, there's so much that they have to solve beyond just interstate travel to where they can actually achieve something like that. And Frank, I don't know that we'll ever achieve full autonomy, right? I mean, you have to have generations of people that are comfortable, that trust it, and are accepting of it, and are willing to give up whatever. I mean, it's like giving up your horse and going to an automobile. How did that change your ability to roam the countryside? You obviously had to stick more to roads than you used to have to, and autonomy would be that is big a change, right? Because you no longer have the freedom of maneuver, if you will.
That's a very interesting point. It's very interesting.
But Darren, let me ask you this. If you look at the interstate highway, it was all standardized. To what extent are we interacting with other states? I mean, when we listen to different states, everything is partitioned, right? But the fact of the situation is mobility in America is mobility. When they did the interstate highways, it was all standardized. As a matter of fact, some can remember when the red lights were not standardized and when the stop signs were not standardized. So my question to you, are you interacting with other states? You guys have meetings about what's going on the mobility. So we interact with Arkansas to the north, we got Louisiana to the east, we got Arizona, to the west. How are we interacting so that when I drive and leave Texas and go through Arkansas, it looks the same like it is today? I mean, are people going to put the same kind of emphasis? Even when I go to Canada and get off the airplane, I'm thinking I'm in New Orleans because of all the stores are the same.
Right.
So what about standardization between states?
Well, so the standardization on the interstate system is still there, and I can't, there are limits to that. Obviously, I mean, different raw materials for the type of road system, that they can build. But the traffic signals and the traffic signage is supposed to be consistent. Now, you will find at times in cities, especially, that they've created their own signage for their own purposes, and then are not in that universal standard is regularly being updated. As it relates to electrification, we are talking to other states as we've been actually putting what we're calling study areas on the map. We've actually looked at how that relates to what they're doing on our border states to, again, to achieve some semblance of a 50-mile distance from each other, to make sure that you have some reliability as you transition, especially not so much on the interstates. That's gonna be done, but as you transition along state highways or U.S. highways, that you see some consistency there. And we do have a number of organizations. We have the American State Highway Transportation Organization, so we all meet continuously with them. We have consolidated research effort. And then beyond EV, I'm in a number of autonomous associations with other states where we're actually, as a community practice, talking about different state laws and how we can work towards common standards with the federal government, because that's really what interstate movement or cross-country movement is in need of, is a consistent set of standards as it relates to not only autonomy but every form of mobility.
This is interesting. And as we move toward vertical takeoff, I know I'm working with a company here in Austin that's going to take me from my home to the university or wherever, vertically. And so that means the airways and clearing the airways. How far along are we in the city for vertical takeoff? And not, I mean, for human beings, not necessarily for packages. I know that packages, and Willie Nelson like to deliver stuff now vertically. As Willie would say, oh my gosh, things have come a long ways in that commercial. Mhm.
I think it all depends upon the speed at which the FAA is willing to allow that type of mobility. I mean, it's, when you're talking about passenger related system, it's actually, in my mind, a little bit easier because you're effectively flying something that's very similar to a helicopter, right? So there's already existing rules about the airport itself, the air corridors, all those things are already in place. And in many cases, passenger-based VTOL can take advantage of those because you're really just talking about a platform that's typically electrified and may have different rotor setups. And if they can get the platform approved and those kind of things addressed, then the mobility piece, as long as you don't want to drastically change from the existing air network, I think that's doable, and that could happen in the next 5 to 10 years. When you get to something more aggressive in terms of movement, and when you get to something more aggressive about airspace deconfliction, not only with commercial aircraft and general aviation, but also other helicopters and now drones, it's a much more complex system. And I think that's what the FAA is really trying to wrestle with, is how are they going to deal with a much denser system than they've ever had to. And it's certainly not visual flight recognition, which is what we've traditionally done outside of commercial aircraft. So it's going to be a challenge as to how that's done and automated. And if you track, there's already challenges in growing the existing air traffic control network that the FAA operates, and this just adds to that dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Yeah, I think it's a challenge, but I think it's coming. And I guess I should ask, Andre's tradition, do we have enough electricity to do all of this?
No.
No, we don't.
I mean, do we have enough?
We're going to have to build a lot of nuclear power plants.
We don't have enough engineers.
You did freeze, Andreas. You just froze.
His electricity is disconnected.
Yeah, Andreas, you did just freeze. You froze.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we're lacking engineers to deliver all that. So it's
We're lacking engineers, we're lacking generators, we're lacking transmission. It cannot happen at the rate at which people expect it will happen. Just can't be done.
Definitely not at the rate that is needed to quote unquote.
Oops, you froze again. Well, that Ford Motor Company created their own engineers when there was a short of engineers to create the Model T.
Well,
I think you guys hit on something important. I mean, if you want these things to happen, America, it has to be a national effort, not a nationalized, but a national effort. It really has to be a true strategy, not just putting money against one component of
cities own roads,
a given area, right? And that's a challenge that we have right now is, are we looking at the entirety of any given one of these efforts, electrification, vertical takeoff and landing, and what are all the components that would be necessary to make that happen? And how are we then enabling all of that as opposed to just one, generalized area of it?
Well, there's going to be a partnership between the private sector and the public. Just like we did also with MCC and all of the major research that goes to universities, that's all your tax dollars. So we know whether it's electrification, it's going to be a partnership between the entrepreneurs, the private sector, at least here in Texas, and the public sector, right? And as you know, we've done that with roads and highways also. And I think that's very, very important. And so what we say is that if there's a need, an entrepreneur will step up and try to solve that need for us. You keep freezing, Andre. Okay, go ahead, Llewellyn.
Sorry, I was going to say that electricity has one particular problem that many things don't. Everybody is an expert on it. It is amazing the stuff I read about. You can shut down all the natural gas tomorrow and use wind and solar. Everybody's an expert, and it is amazing the pressure the number of emails I get from people saying, why are you pushing this dead tartan? You're causing global warming. We can go green today, and we can't. There's no subject. It reminds me of what Mark Twain said. He said, no person would stand at the podium and endeavor to play the fiddle without some prior instruction in the instrument. But there is no such inhibition when it comes to writing. Well, there's no such inhibition when it comes to electric policy. You don't have to know anything about it. You just have to have an electric light. And then you assume you know all about it.
That's
Can
wrong.
you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
So Darren, real quick, one question that is really critical for folks to understand. Of all your stakeholders that you manage, there is one stakeholder that I think is probably the most challenging to manage, to replace, to live without, to live with, which is the diesel stakeholder, the trucks. And if you cannot replace diesel, if you cannot replace the trucks, nothing will change. So where are we on managing trucks? What is the goal?
I don't know that we have a goal in TXDOT about what fuel they should use. I mean, talking about taking industry lead, I've talked to them quite a bit that they have great concerns in some cases about electrification. They say that if they have to change fuels, that it would probably be more likely that they would use hydrogen. I think you really have to parse what segment you're talking about, because I'm really talking about long haul freight in this case. Anything short of that, I think that you have a much greater potential for alternate fuels now being used than in some distant future. But there are organizations right now that are working on both for long haul freight as well, and they believe that it's feasible, and that the scale, that the concerns over weight of the batteries and all that are already near to being addressed. So we'll see. I'm surprised every year at the advancement on all those avenues, and maybe they'll make a breakthrough that would change that.
The reason I bring that up is because if anybody's really serious about reducing our carbon footprint through electrification, we have to crack the code on replacing diesel, which if we don't work on it, it's going to take 20 years or 30 years, because I mean, that is a serious infrastructure, a serious investment that has been made to move everything in America.
Yeah. Well, and we're a huge, freight state. So it's a significant, the price is going up on diesel, or, much more so than even gasoline right now.
Right.
So we're faced with, a real potential of goods shortages if they can no longer afford to haul the freight, or the cost of goods goes up so much that nobody can afford to, purchase them.
Right.
Very good point.
But that's one of the reasons why, haven't solved the electrification piece, but we've been working on the autonomous piece of freight. I mean, you may know Texas is probably the leading state in autonomous freight development, not because of us, but because of the freight developers wanting to come here based upon, the laws our legislature have put in place. And they're making great strides. I mean, I've ridden with a few of them. I know that they're moving. They still have drivers in the cab, but long stretches of 45 and other interstates, they're effectively hands off the wheel now, and impressively safe.
Yeah. Let me take a moment. Let me take a moment to share my screen and remind folks of our annual conference coming up September 6th through the 9th. And we have had everybody here today be part of our conference in the past, and hopefully in the future. Next year's conference is at the JW Marriott downtown in Austin, Texas. And it's going to be a dandy. We will have similar players like we had before speaking and gracing our presence. Want to remind everybody the work that we're doing at Texas State. We have 3 mobility labs being planned, along with many other labs, and we're very excited about that. And I want to thank Texas State for sponsoring the Digital RoundTable. Darren, about Cedar. What's your take on it? No commitment of any kind, but what is your take on what we're trying to do there? And you just helped us with, supporting an idea that we're flooding to get federal funding. What's your thoughts on Cedar and what we're trying to do?
Well, I started talking system of systems. I love the slide you just showed about the pillars.
Mhm,
Because I think all of those are critical to, not just to mobility, but to each one of those communities.
mhm,
But we all impact each other. And so the ability to test, the ability to educate, our future developers and then leaders of those systems,
mhm.
and the ability to have it here close to home, I think is huge, right? And with the growing core, here in the Central Texas area, I think, what you guys are doing is going to be vital to that effort.
Yeah, absolutely. Daryl, real quick, if you think about the next 90 days, what's top of mind? What's in front of you right now that you're dealing with?
Well, getting that electric vehicle plan approved is right there at the top of it, along with our urban air mobility report that's due to the legislature. And then probably, ramping up a number of, the other efforts I talked about along autonomy networks and those considerations as we go into the period that precedes the next legislative session. And it's really not only preparing that for that, but that's where we get a lot of work done to move things forward while we move into session.
Right. Llewellyn, Johnny, final thoughts, questions?
I think it's very, very interesting. Of course, you sit at the very, very pinnacle of allowing us to do business in the future. We must keep in mind, as you said, that all of the decisions that we make will have a big impact on how business is done, how products are moved, how people are moved, how we have different kinds of conferences and stuff. It's almost like saying, how do we make Austin a place where people like to have conferences? Well, we want to make Texas a place where people want to move their enterprises to continue to create 4 times the amount of jobs than any other state in the country. I think that the challenges are there, but there's nothing that you cannot do. And I expect from you fast trains. I expect from you mobility, upward mobility, and I expect from you that those things will happen.
Well, I'm sure they will. I think that the great challenge, and I salute you for the way you're approaching this, Darren, and that is with transportation, it's not more of what we had, but more of the future, what we might want, which is probably not a point-to-point transportation. It may or may not be a revised concept of the individual car or vehicle. And I think the electrification is going to go as fast as the electricity is available. It can't go faster. You've got a new fuel source, untested. You've got expectations that are gigantic against a resource base that is limited. So there's going to be a crunch there, and it's going to be very interesting. Maybe we can overcome the crunch, but I think the work you're doing on sensors, etc., is absolutely vital to getting from here to here, and more power to you.
Yeah, I do hope, if I may, Darren, that TXDOT be allowed to be the next generation infrastructure highway provider, not just for roads and bridges and tunnels, but for flying vehicles, for autonomous vehicles, all connected with one single network that manages all these sensors and all these vehicles, and in the exchange of how they operate safely, as we may have, autonomous lanes for trucks and autonomous lanes for cars and what have you, and whatever that mix of taxonomy and soup is going to look like when you all decide what works and what doesn't work in Texas. But I am very excited about the future and the role that we can play as citizens, as entrepreneurs, as academics into what's coming. And I wish you the best, and let's continue to stay in touch and dialogue and see how we can collaborate. And thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Johnny, take us away.
Okay. If I could save time in a bottle, the first thing that I like to do is to save every day like a treasure, and then again I will spend them with you. But there never seemed to be enough time to do the things you want to do once you find them. Looked around enough to know you're the one I want to go through time with.
Thank you, Darren, for being with us today.
Thank you, Darren. You did good.
Thanks, y'all.